record to this computer. Okay, I believe we are recording. So welcome, gentlemen, caballeros. So why don't we start with this whole question of the pseudo-scientific basis for racism and then this quasi-cultural basis. So
by
Bob,
pseudoscientific, you mean the sort of older scientific version of racism, that I'm going to measure the size of your nostrils and look at the bumps on your head and I'll know who's in which category, and my category is always the one that comes on top. Is that's pseudoscientific? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've been talking about this a lot in my class, and I mean, the scientific consensus around those kinds of ideas is mostly gone. I would say it's not entirely gone. So for example, right now we're reading an essay about hypertension in African Americans, and how for years people thought there was some genetic cause that people of African descent have higher blood pressure. And it's because of this sort of error in thinking where if you see group differences, they must be due to some intrinsic genetic difference between the group, right?
Right.
Which is, I mean, not to spoil the punchline, but it's oftentimes not real. I mean, there are cases where it is real. I mean, like sickle cell anemia, that's a sort of example, but those are the exceptions rather than the rule, right?
Didn't you tell me another time that sickle cell is actually associated with being in the area where there are mosquitoes that carry malaria, not actually with race?
That's
that's
absolutely my thing.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's right. But it does sort of correlate with race, right? Because when you live in areas where Anopheles mosquitoes live, you tend to have darker skin, right? But that's, yeah.
But well, the causation correlation thing seems the most powerful way to debunk the like what you call this sort of old version of doing science, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it's I mean, there are all sorts of issues with thinking about race in this way, but the biggest one is that racial differences, if you're talking about genetics, are relatively recent, and probably most of them aren't very important in terms of functionality, right? So in other words, the misstep that people make is they think that because they see differences, those differences must be advantageous or disadvantageous. And when you start thinking about groups in that way, it's pretty natural to flow from that into a hierarchy, right? Where therefore this group is superior to this group, and therefore we can justify doing terrible things to them because they're genetically inferior.
Well, I think that's one of the themes that for me ties together the pseudoscientific and the pseudo-cultural or cultural or religious is the inability to think about difference without imposing a hierarchy, without imposing that there can't be a plain difference without a value difference as well, right? So it's not a surprise to me that that sort of infiltrates scientific thinking.
Well, it even infiltrates it to a weird degree. I mean, when the European colonial powers first started thinking about race in this sort of pseudo-scientific way, their theory was that white people were the original people, and that the sort of darker races were a corrupted version of white people, which is actually exactly backwards from the way it works.
It's like the orcs.
Right. So the idea, but the point there is that the science was a post hoc justification for the exploitation, right? I mean, it wasn't.
Well, and I've read the science sort of cuts in both directions, because there's folks in, I think it's in the 17th century, that are worried that if they spend too much time in equatorial Africa, or if they spend too much time in India, that they'll actually degrade their, I mean, they're not using DNA at that time, but the sort of stock is going to sort of degrade, right? That there's this weird almost recognition that environmental factors are in there, but it gets twisted in the way you're sort of just saying, this sort of correlation causation thing gets turned backwards, right?
There is that language that when I lived in Sri Lanka, I'd read a lot of, and I was reading a lot of colonial texts. There's a lot of talk about, so-and-so came over and now they're deracinated. And which is the language I always thought, like, they've gone native essentially, but it was a way of giving it this kind of, like they've lost whatever made them a member of this conquering race.
So maybe that's the colonial version of white fragility.
Yeah. Hey, so Rob, I didn't think of this until you were talking, but I think we've talked about it before, but science has this ability to self-correct and to kind of overcome earlier biases. And you see that to some extent with race, and you see that with, gender. But it's funny that there still is a lot of racial bias maybe not amongst science, maybe not in science, but certainly amongst scientists or amongst the medical professions or amongst science
well, and some of it I would argue is actually well-intentioned, which is maybe not obvious. But so, for example, the thing about hypertension that really struck me as I was reading about this is that was actually started as a good faith effort to understand, okay, so African Americans have higher blood pressure. They definitely have a higher rate of heart disease and stroke that's probably resulting from that higher blood pressure. And so the idea was we really should be taking this into account when treating these patients. And so, it leads to all this research. But then the problem is they're presupposing that the cause is genetic, which leads you down a different road than if you accept that the cause could be environmental, meaning having to do with stressors or diet or lack of access to good healthcare, all these other sorts of measures that would cause the same thing, right, as a genetic difference.
Well, or let me pose the question a different way, because like many years ago, I had a job working for this associate provost at Carnegie Mellon, and her goal was to kind of increase the number of women and people of color in the STEM fields. And so the problem didn't seem to be the science, but there definitely were like barriers that scientists presented. And certainly it was really clear with women, because you'd have like 500 electrical engineers and one female electrical engineer. One of the things I discovered in that job was that every single female professor in the STEM fields was on antidepressants, which kind of goes back to your question about hypertension. That wasn't some problem that they brought to it. It was the problem that the other professors kind of created. So I don't know. Since we're talking about how foundational systems of belief like racism shape and kind of form other things, I don't know. I guess I just curious as
I want to go back to your question about science's capacity to self-correct. So I think I get that, and we've talked about it before, so I'm pretty sure I get it, but I want to hear Rob articulate it, because I think there's something there that helps us understand the difference between science and scientists and the difference between science and religion, right? This is a sort of good pivot question, like how do systems of ideology change over time? And what is this sort of self-correcting mechanism within science that fixes the science, but we can still have scientists that don't get it? So what's that corrective, Rob?
Yeah, so in science, basically what happens is the incentive structure actually works pretty well in that you get the most bang for your career and your advancement if you can overthrow old ideas, right? So in a sense, that makes it, that presents some of its own problems, but it is very good at correcting wrong things, right? Because if data starts to accumulate, so for example, if we're talking about race, once genomic data of humans became widely available and people started analyzing that data, it became clear that the racial definitions we use are pretty meaningless. They're not completely meaningless, but they're darn close to being meaningless, right? And so I think that's an easy change for science, right? Because you just, you publish the data, everyone reads it, they can understand it, fine. But scientists, of course, are people, and they have their own implicit bias. And I would say that bias is not only racial, it has to do with discipline. So for example, if you're an adaptationist evolutionist, right, then everything's an adaptation to you, right? It's just like when you're a hammer, everything's a nail, right? It's the same idea. So I think what happens sometimes is that people see answers that fit into their preconception of how science works. And sometimes those are associated with racial questions. And then that becomes harder to shake, right? Because you've sort of got a double bias there. You've got the racial bias that's implicit in society, and you've got the person's scientific bias coming into play, which is making them less likely to overturn the idea. And so, you know, I think that happens a lot because, you know, the idea that you know, humans are just a continuum and racial groups are kind of meaningless. Okay, except that we say that, but we don't act like it, right? Because we study ancestral population groups all the time, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, I was thinking the hammer and nail thing when you were talking about African Americans and hypertension. That study was probably done by someone who is really worried about genetics, right? As opposed to someone that lived in a neighborhood with a whole bunch of men who had hypertension.
Right. So it's like, so to give you another example, there's this famous quote by JBS Haldane, who's one of my favorite scientists ever. And he said that teleology is the biologist's mistress, right? He can't be without her, but he also can't be seen in public with her. And so basically the idea is that, okay, we know that things in biological systems are not designed, right? Or at least that's not how we believe that they work, but it's really hard to get the idea of purpose for biological structures out of your head. So I would argue it's similar with race. You know, intellectually you can understand that race is not real, but getting that implicit sort of tribal bias out of your head is much harder than that.
And it seems like one of the big connections, I sort of was trying to draw this connection between science and scientists and science and religion. The connection between the science and the scientist, the reason the science can be corrected is because you have to be explicit about everything in your argument. You have to be explicit about your data. But so much in, like you said, we're human beings, so much in the mind of a person when they're making sense out of the world around them is beneath the surface, right? So lots of folks will use this metaphor of the iceberg, that our conscious stuff is up top, but all the stuff that shapes us and sort of determines what we see. And like you were saying, the stuff that you're looking for is not always this conscious stuff you're looking for, right? And that's where all the unconscious stuff and the categories that we're not aware of, because we're culturally taught to not think about that stuff and not notice this stuff. This brings it back to John's talking about sort of colorblind, right? We've got this idea consciously that we just need to treat everybody the same. And the best way to do that is to not see color at all, right? The problem with that is we erase all the specificity, we erase all the history, we erase all the sort of power relations. So it has this prima facie, this at first glance look of neutrality, right? Colorblind sounds great. Like I'm treating everybody fairly. But what's really going on is that you're giving free rein to all the unconscious stuff. And it seems like that's where the corrective of science is really good, but it stays in the science because we can't examine all of our own sort of assumptions. We can't examine the prejudices that sort of have been built up since we were 5. And we not only have never thought about them, but there's a whole bunch in our society that forces us to ignore it. And I think that's why the colorblind thing is so appealing until you start thinking about it, right? If we applied that to any other social identity, it would be obvious how dumb it is. Like, I don't see age. A 5-year-old boy and an 85-year-old man, they're the same thing to me, right? I don't see gender. Like the stuff it erases is the stuff that matters, right? And when you talk about color blindness with race, if you erase all the colors and your default position is white, then all you're doing is making everyone else white.
But poorer white.
Right.
Darker white.
But you're ignoring the fact that they're poor. So we're equal.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, there's some other reason. And that's what I think is so, as you're talking about this, I thought about, there's this, something I showed in class today is this documentary. And one of the things they talked about was James Baldwin said, basically like history captures people and people are captured by history. Like we're all kind of trapped in our history. And what color blindness does is actually it obliterates our history and then allows us to go back and talk about the past. So I've taught, these kind of subjects about race and class and all these things. And everyone's perfectly fine sounding like Karl Marx if you're talking about like 1855 or even 1895. Nobody has a problem saying, oh my God, that is completely racist. That's so out of line. They're just exploiting those people because they can get away with it. The closer and closer you get to the present, the more people start to sound like Paul Ryan, or, you know, because they start to become less and less comfortable. And then you have to find some way to defend your position in that setup. And it can't be, I was, you know, my position of relative privilege was produced by these systems that are really unfair. No. My parents, my grandparents worked really hard. I worked really hard. And that's why I'm where I'm at. So
And I think that the part you said about history is the most intriguing for me, because, and I think it's a bridge from the science to the cultural stuff, right? Is that science is in one way ahistorical, in the sense that we're in the eternal present, right? We're trying to figure out these processes that always work the same. Where what Christianity does, the two things it does that sort of feed into and help create racism more than anything else is this universalization and this ahistoric, right? This is a truth that transcends history, right? So when in the 5th and 6th century, and a little bit earlier, but sort of beginning in the 3rd, but really clearly in the 5th century, when they begin to dissociate Jesus from his Jewishness, and in the attempt to make him more universal, in order to the attempt to make him the sort of uber man that sort of relates to everybody. The problem is they've unconsciously got this idea of who they are as the default position, right? So the beginning of anti-Semitism, which is the sort of seed that grows into racism, is theologically blaming the Jews that killed Christ. But that becomes a lot harder if you remember that Jesus was Jewish, right? So the move to abstract him, to make him a universal man instead of a specific man, is one of the sort of key seeds, right? But in order to make sure that we don't remember that, we have to think about religion and Christianity specifically as this ahistorical truth that transcends the sort of specific moment in time and place, right? So Christ's sacrifice didn't happen at a particular moment in the body of a male heterosexual Jew. It's just, he became a man, right? And then we could sort of talk about genderism. Why does he have to be a man and a woman? But sort of the ahistorical thing allows us to think about these categories at face value. Again, this sort of illusion that we're treating them the same, where we're covering up and erasing the sort of historical realities. Like, how did Jesus become white? And how do we think about race when these folks look like this and these folks look like that? And the sort of ahistorical, we don't ever have to look at that stuff again. But what I hear is what you said, it allows us to go back into history, right? What does dehistoricizing it do when we go back and look at history? I think I know what you're talking about, but
well, I mean, what Baldwin is talking about is that we're, you know, all of us are trapped by the history that we don't necessarily see. But he also, other places he talks about how there's a kind of sadness and a kind of shallowness and emptiness of white people because they refuse to actually deal with their own history. So in a way, Baldwin always feels like white people don't know themselves. They don't want to know themselves. They can't love themselves. And the whole basis for racism is if white people, it's always posed as like as the Negro problem, kind of like at the early 20th century. And he kept saying, there's no Negro problem, there's a white problem. Right. And the problem is like whites' inability to kind of deal with their own selves. So they create this hierarchy that makes them feel better about themselves because they have to be on top of somebody else. But then, and if you take that away from them, then they're just back to this existential problem of.
Right. But I think the other thing with the sort of history factor for me is it's not simply that we can never talk about history, but it's always a selective remembering of history.
Right.
Right.
The myths. Yeah,
the mythologizing of history. That's a perfect way to get at, right? That it's the stories we tell ourselves are the stories we want to hear, not the stories we need to hear. Right. And I think this is where religion is a good source, because the stories that religions have crafted are the most important stories about who we are. but it's also missing the stories about the most important parts of who we are. Or when we read the stories, so when we read Genesis, we talk about how awesome that sort of God made us, and we talk about how great it is that sort of he made the world in 7 days, and the sort of perfect world that we set up. But we miss out on the parts of those stories that are kind of disturbing, right? The snake is the only one that tells the truth in that story, the whole truth and the full whole truth. And the punishment for Eve is that she will constantly be craving for her husband, but she will never be able to be in charge. Actually, that's not right. I'm messing it up, but there's a sort of double punishment. You will always want your husband, but he will, that's it. You will always want your husband, but he will always be your master over you. And if we read that carefully, it's like, oh, right, who wrote this? Probably not women, right? Where the stories become the tools with which we understand history. So Exodus is about God saving us from slavery and giving us this new land where no one lives there, so we can just move right in and everything's empty. Well, but they also tell the stories about the people they killed to take over Israel, right? And when folks come to America, they tell the story of Exodus. And of course, North America is conceived of as empty. But in reality, there was a whole bunch of people here. And the Catholic Church said any land not owned by Christians is free, is not owned, and Christians should go in and take over. The doctrine of discovery basically religiously legitimated stealing the entire world from anyone who was already living there. Right, so we were talking right before the start of this about how central is this to Christianity? What's the relationship between religion and Christianity? If we go back to the anti-Semitism, it's in the DNA of Christianity pretty early.
Right. So here's something I would to mess with you, and I'll be interested in what you all think. So I kind of like McGhee's take that, like, basically that white supremacy is this foundational belief system that then forms, or as I said, corrupts, but as you said, pointed out, forms, Judaism, Islam, Christianity for sure. And yet, one of the most powerful ways that when there are movements that challenge that system, they've often come out of a religious grounding. Like certainly the whole civil rights movement is that. Yeah. And indeed, I've heard an argument that says one of the things that happens after you take prayer out of schools and Bible study out of schools, after those kind of atheist campaigns, is
which
a lot of campaigns? Well, there's the the whole atheist agenda that you're part of. Anyway, no, but that basically that religion became that up until then, when there was a whole generations of people who went through public school, had an understanding and a foundation of Christianity, and it tended to kind of get pushed in a liberal direction or get pushed in a direction and said, well, this is all messed up because here's a passage that talks about we're all children of God. So it sort of primed the civil rights movement that when people would speak in that language, it's not like it worked overnight, and it's not like it worked completely well, but at least created some room both for the people, for the whites receiving it to kind of hear like, oh yeah, like we're not being very good Christians. And certainly for the people participating in that movement, they sort of saw themselves as acting or hoping to kind of fulfill the will of some broader humanity or broader divinity.
Yeah, you did a whole bunch of stuff there. So let me start with the is it in our DNA? I'm interested to hear Rob's take on this metaphor. The metaphor you choose for the relationship between racism and Christianity is going to tell you whether Christianity is corrupted by racism or whether racism is inherent in Christianity, right? So the metaphor of corruption or invasion or infection or disruption or distortion, all of those assume that Christianity is a good thing that has been twisted by some thing coming in from the outside, right? So if we use the metaphor of an infection or a virus, then it's clear we can just get rid of the virus and I can go back to this organism that's back to its sort of primal state, right? But what if our metaphor instead is of mitochondria, right? Human beings are not just sort of straight up DNA. We're a colony organism, and Rob will correct me if I'm using the wrong words here. But the mitochondria has now become a part of what it means to be human. Could we get rid of mitochondria? No. So the question is, what do we do with this metaphor? If I get rid of the mitochondria, I really can't exist, right? So the metaphor doesn't work perfectly. If we get rid of racism as a part of Christianity in America, is it that Christianity no longer exists, or is it that Christianity no longer looks like the thing it did when racism was going on, right? And that's where the metaphor, I think, is really tricky. My guess is when Christians were the scapegoats and punished by the Romans and thrown to lions and all this bad stuff, they weren't racist, because you need to be in charge to be racist, right? But they didn't learn the lesson of humility. They didn't learn the lesson of martyrdom, that you don't oppress people, and they wind up becoming the oppressor, right? And as I said earlier with the doctrine of discovery, that slavery makes racism, right? Racism is constructed by white Christians to justify slavery. So it's a thing they made, and it's a thing that they got from their religion. And then that gets to your second question. What do we do about the fact that Christians are arguing for slavery, and Christians are arguing against slavery, and Christians are arguing for equality, and Christians are arguing against equality? That we need to hold on to the internal diversity of Christians, right? Of Christianity. So several people have said this, but Frederick Douglass said, the difference between the Christianity of this world and the Christianity of Jesus, I cannot see a bigger gap. I cannot see a bigger space between these two. So the question then becomes, what's the real Christianity? But I think that's the wrong question. The Christianity that's real is the one that people do, the one that people live, the thing that's out there, right? There is no Christianity except for people. So as long as people are doing this thing, it's Christianity. If your definition of racism is, I've intentionally got this idea that you are bad and I'm going to do something because of that intent, then the number of racist people gets really small. If your definition of racism is people in the dominant culture doing behaviors that have detrimental effects against people that are marginalized, then we're all sort of seeped in racism. It's not that we're racist or not racist. That's not the question. Are the actions that we take having a racist effect on people, right? And this is where one reading of Christianity is we're all radically equal in a way. And folks were making this argument about slavery. You can't hold them in slavery if they're Christians, because the Bible says we're all free. And other people are saying, right, but I enslaved them to make them Christian, so that's a good thing, right? Like if we're saving souls, then slavery becomes a tool for good. It's saying that out loud is just weird, right? But then there's this tension. I like having free labor, but I think all Christians are equal. And what happens is the self-interest, right? And then the easy answer is, well, you're doing Christianity wrong. But the problem is we've got people saying doing that right is the point. That and this is sort of my internal debate is, how long is it going to be in my DNA before it's a part of who I am? How long is something Christian because a Christian does it? Like my tie. It was made by someone who's Christian. Does that make it a Christian tie? Does it have to be worn by someone that's a Christian to be a Christian tie? Does it have to be put to Christian purposes? So this idea of sort of slavery being Christian or not Christian, it sort of misses the point. But Christianity is the primary tool for the last 350 years to make slavery seem okay. And that to me is the real question. How have we convinced ourselves that this thing is okay? Right. And that gets to the question that you asked Rob about what's the self-corrective. And I never thought about this till just now. So this is hot off the presses. The self-correction in Christianity is other people pointing out that the thing you're doing doesn't fit with the other stuff. It's Frederick Douglass saying, hang on, Jesus said we're all equal, and you're beating someone. Like, one way to do that is to say you're using the wrong part of the Bible. The other way to do it is to say, okay, this is what Christianity sounds like to me. I can't imagine a God that does this, or I can't imagine a God that's going to sanction you beating someone just because they're not working hard enough. That Christianity isn't a single thing. It's an argument made by people claiming legitimacy by calling it Christianity.
So I've got to go because I've got to go pick up my daughter. But I just wanted to throw something out there that I've been thinking of as you guys were talking. So to go back to the colorblind thing for a minute and this sort of idea of equality. I mean, if science is saying that race is not real, and you hear that all the time, right? People will proclaim this. Oh, science says race doesn't exist. And then reading this essay, it seemed like the bad thing that can come out of that is the denial that racism exists, right? Mm-hmm. And so I guess my question is it possible to understand that race does not exist, but still hold in your head that racism is a problem? Do you understand what I mean? In other words, does the denial of racism necessarily follow the denial of race? I guess I don't know the answer, right? But it would help me understand the colorblind thing a little better.
The analogy I use is money. I can know that money is fake, but I still need money to pay my bills.
Right.
That's a simple answer, but I mean, that's a great question.
Yeah. Well, thanks, gentlemen. This is
right.
This I think it's a wonderful conversation as always. It's a pleasure, and
Definitely.
And we will to be continued.
All right.
Talk to you again.
All right. I'm gonna